When a colleague remarked, "Who knew accounts payable was so complicated?" I knew I had to make this podcast. Stick around while I do a quick review of the 30 subjects, yes, 30, needed for a top-notch accounts payable function.
Welcome to the AP Now podcast, the podcast that covers trends, insights, and emerging issues impacting every accounts payable function.
Hi guys, I'm Mary Schaefer, founder of AP Now, the place where you go for all the latest business intelligence you need if you work in, manage, or have responsibility for the accounts payable function. Today's episode was inspired, if you will, by a comment left on one of our recent podcasts. The person wrote, "Who knew accounts payable could be so complicated?" It was not said maliciously, but truly out of wonder, and it inspired me to compile a list of things that someone needs to know in order to work in accounts payable and do an effective job. And then that led to this podcast. Now, before I go through the 30 different areas people need to be knowledgeable about that are on my list, let's take a quick peek at what can go wrong if your staff isn't fully trained and up to speed on some of these topics. Now, to be clear, yes, 30 topics, but you don't have to be an expert at all of them. You just have to know what they are, know a little bit about them, and then depending upon the nature of your organization and the nature of your business, that will determine how much of an expert or not you need to be about some of these topics. And for a few of you, a few of the topics will not be necessary, but not bad to know because you never know what the future brings. Okay, so what can go wrong if your staff isn't up to speed and your accounts payable function isn't best practice? Real quickly, I've got 5 things. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. I just want to mention them. You're probably aware of them, but it helps me bring home this point. Anyway, so if you are not using best practices and the latest practices for that matter, and you don't have all the knowledge, or your staff doesn't have all the knowledge that they need to have, you can end up with duplicate payments. And before you say, "Oh, no big deal, our vendors will return the duplicates," most of them don't. Poor or less than current, if you will, practices facilitates fraud. And in fact, a recent survey by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners pointed out that 1/3 of occupational frauds were associated with weak internal controls. So if you think that maybe I'm exaggerating, the fraud examiners certainly aren't. When you don't have all the latest business intelligence, your regulatory compliance is going to suffer, and that's going to lead to a lot of headaches. And let me tell you, those are not fun. Your inefficient processes in accounts payable, the bottom line of using them will be a more expensive accounts payable function. So you'll be spending more than you should. And finally, poor practices based on, well, whatever, but definitely on not staying current and not being efficient typically leads to late payments, and late payments definitely lead to unhappy suppliers. So none of these outcomes are things that we want. And by making sure our accounts payable staff is up to snuff on the 30 different areas that we're going to go into, you can avoid it. So we're not going to spend a lot of time, but we are going to go through them. So I've divided these 30 different areas into 6 groups, if you will. And so let's start with what I call the basics or the best practices. So your people should know, obviously, the basics of how the accounts payable function works. And they should know what the best practices are, and they should make sure that they've incorporated strong internal controls into them, not only around the accounts payable process, but also around the payment process. Because if you don't, you're not really using best practices. Your folks should also know just a little bit about accounting. They don't have to be CPAs, although it wouldn't hurt. And in fact, in many organizations, the person who runs the accounts payable department is a CPA. That's not really necessary, although it's a nice thing to have. But your people should know a little about accounting, debits and credits, and where accounts payable fits into the whole thing. They also need to know when best practices change and what these new best practices are, and they need to incorporate them into your operations, because otherwise some of the things we talked about at the beginning will happen, and there are things we're trying to avoid. And lastly, your people should be able to look at the best practices, look at your current operations, and make process improvement recommendations. Okay, that's enough about the basics. Let's move on and talk about technology, because we can't talk about accounts payable today without talking about technology. So at a minimum, your folks should know how to operate the accounts payable functionality within your ERP system. Okay, that's kind of a given. And, if they know a little bit more, it wouldn't hurt. They don't have to just know the bare minimum, but, the bare minimum, I guess, will do in certain situations. They should know about the new accounts payable services and solutions that are coming out on the market, understand them a little bit. Things like invoice automation, accounts payable automation, know how they work, know at least in general. And then when you select one of these, of course, know how to use it, learn how to use it. They should also know a little bit about cryptocurrencies. We're starting to hear a lot about Bitcoin, and Bitcoin being used in various different places. That's starting to become more mainstream. Likewise, blockchain. You can't work at a large organization. Well, I guess you can. But if you want to be best practice, you really need to understand blockchain because it's starting to infiltrate a lot of different functions within the corporate world. When we talk about Bitcoin and we talk about automation and all these things, these are typically based on AI, artificial intelligence, and robotic process automation, RPA. So your people should understand a little bit just what it is and how it impacts the accounts payable function. Now, as we go along with all this new technology and all these different things coming at us, there will be new applications coming out for accounts payable that can be used to make the accounts payable function more efficient and effective, and your folks should be up to date on that. Okay, enough about technology, although I could talk about technology for quite a bit. Let's turn our attention now to fraud, because unfortunately, fraud protection, which typically involves prevention, detection, and also deterring fraud, has become a real important issue, given all the new frauds that are out there. So your folks should know what the basic fraud protection strategies are, things like positive pay for checks, etc. They should also know which internal controls you should have in place in order to protect against fraud, because that's one way to cut down on fraud. They need to, on a regular basis, be aware, so they need to stay current of whatever new frauds are out there, and they need to learn about these frauds as soon as that information becomes available, because the sooner the better. And the sooner you are aware of it and can make some changes, the less likely you are to become a victim, if you will. And along the same lines, once they learn what these frauds are, they need to be able to create new practices and processes, if they are required, which they often are, in order to help protect the organization against fraud. Okay, now, before we talk about the analytical, the regulatory, and the soft skills needed, because we're only halfway there, I'd like to invite you to subscribe. It's completely free, and you can unsubscribe at any time. By ringing the bell next to the subscribe button, you'll be notified when we post new accounts payable content, which we do 2 or 3 times a week. And by the way, you don't need to have a YouTube account in order to subscribe. You can subscribe if you have a simple Gmail account, which many, many people do. Okay, now let's talk about analytics. So at a very minimum, your folks should know the basics of Excel, okay? Because you're going to use Excel in various different tasks within your accounts payable function, especially when you start benchmarking and creating some metrics. It would also be nice if, in addition to the basics, your folks knew how to use some of the more advanced features, things like pivot tables and power queries, and etc. There's a whole lot of stuff that can be done using Excel. And basically, it's just some of the basics, but some of the more advanced things also. Conditional formatting, a very basic function within Excel, can be used, for example, to identify duplicates. It's something we're always looking for in accounts payable. If your organization has purchased any specialty analytics programs, which I know some companies do, then your accounts payable staff will need to learn how to use at least the basics, etc. They should be able to use these programs and come up with some basic metrics around the accounts payable function. Now, some of these metrics will come straight from your ERP system, and they should know which they can pull from the ERP system. And so if you haven't already looked to see what's available, then you should do so. And by the way, when you look at what's available, you might also want to have a talk with whoever is in charge of your ERP system, because there might be some functionality that you can use in accounts payable that has been turned off. That's a frequent thing we run into. Okay, so you want to be able to calculate these basic metrics, whether they come from the ERP, Excel, or some specialty program. And lastly, you want to have people who can look at these metrics and make some best practice recommendations as to fixing a problem. I like to calculate metrics because sometimes they help you identify areas where there might be a problem. Okay, could talk a lot about analytics, but I'll spare you, and we're going to move on to regulatory issues. Now, in most countries, but definitely in the United States, there are a lot of regulatory issues that you folks need to know about. So at a minimum in the United States, they need to know about 1099s and 1042s, and they also need to know how to collect and verify the W-9s or the W-8s if that's what's required. Okay, that's for information reporting, tax reporting purposes of payments made to independent contractors. You also need to know the ins and outs of sales and use tax and make sure that your organization is accruing and paying whatever it should, if you're dealing with vendors who are not able to. Unclaimed property, everyone should be reporting and remitting. And I know at this point in time, probably only about a third of all companies in the United States are reporting and remitting. So we need to up our game in that regard, if you will. The two others that I always like to talk about together are the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is Don't Bribe a Foreign Government Official, and OFAC, which is Don't Do Business with Terrorists, basically, also fall under the purview of the Accounts Payable Department. And sometimes people will say, well, I don't understand. Why are you talking to Accounts Payable or even accounting for that matter? They're not bribing a foreign government official or deciding to do business with terrorists, and that's true. However, they are the last set of eyes to see that money before it goes out the door. And for that reason, they need some training in that regard. And they can save the company a lot of headache, because if you get dinged by the SEC or the Department of Justice with the FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violation, it is ugly, okay? It is not pretty. So you want to be able to prevent that. So what they will do or should do is flag what they consider to be questionable payments, and then have somebody probably on your legal staff who is an expert in these matters look at them. Another area where your folks need to be up to date relates to expense reporting, and more specifically the IRS rules regarding what expense reporting, what's deductible and what's not. Now, many companies, they set their policy according to what the IRS will allow them to deduct from the income taxes, but not everybody. So you just have to look at the policy. Obviously, Accounts Payable is not going to do that alone. They'll do that in conjunction with management and somebody from HR, but they need to know what the rules are so that they can effectively manage reimbursement requests. And then if you're not a U.S. company, or if you're doing business internationally, you need to know about VAT and VAT reporting and maybe VAT reclaim, depending upon where you are in the food chain, the value-added tax. Okay, that's regulatory. I want to talk about now the last issue, if you will, is not a topic that people talk about enough. We've kind of ignored it for the last few years, especially with all the focus that's been on technology and new technology. And that's what I call soft skills, becoming a good manager, managing effectively, things like that. At a successful accounts payable department, you need to have a manager who knows how to manage people and how to motivate them, okay? They're not only responsible for their own career development, but they should be doing something to help the staff, and their staff has developed their careers. And we don't pay enough attention to that. Your staff also, your managers, need to know how to run a meeting. And now, running a meeting has been expanded, because it's not only a meeting in, a live meeting, which, we had certain rules for that. It's also online meetings, Zoom or Teams, whatever you happen to be using. So a new skill set, and to be honest, one that nobody's trained for, because, that was not an issue that was even on the table. Okay. And lastly, as we go into whatever we're going to go into, I don't know what we're going to go into in the next few months and the next few years as far as our work situation, but now we have to not only be able to manage in a live setting, but also manage in a hybrid setting, or if we have our staff working remotely. We're going to have all new challenges associated with these different work situations. So folks are going to have to know how to deal with that. So you can see, A lot goes into knowing how to work effectively if you want to be in accounts payable. And by the way, that's all on top of what I haven't discussed, processing invoices and making payments. Clearly, that's a lot of information to cover and a lot of things for people to stay up to date on. That's why AP Now created its Platinum membership, which includes, among other things, 2 webinars a month. On YouTube, a link will appear to the left, as will one on lessons learned from Jeff Bezos for accounts payable, which is episode 114. Good luck.